Thank you, Robot Lady. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Owen Morawitz, and as Sam has mentioned in the preamble, today I will be presenting Corruptions of Form, Trauma and Transformation in Alex Garland's Annihilation. Firstly, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Sam and the team behind Romancing the Gothic for coordinating this month's eco-horror, nature, and the Gothic program, and allowing for me to contribute today. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty, I've kind of got a brief outline of how the presentation will go today. So the first two sections will introduce Annihilation as our primary text before outlining additional genre themes that will help to frame our discussion. Namely, I've broken those into first contact narratives, the concept of eco-horror, and the use of pain as metaphor. And then from that section, I've broken the remaining parts into core units centered around the key elements of my overall thesis, which includes explorations of the weird and the eerie, trauma and landscape, and transformation and mysticism. And then to close, I'll have some brief thoughts on the transmission of affect and this idea I'm working on called becoming change. Okay, with that, let's begin. Sam, just to check, is everything running okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay, cool. So, Annihilation is a 2018 film adaptation written and directed by Alex Garland, based on the 2014 novel of the same name by author Jeff Vandermeer. The original novel is the first entry in Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, with its subsequent entries, Authority and Acceptance, also published in that same year. And I've included the novel and the main poster for the film there for everyone to have a quick look at. So the core element at the heart of Annihilation is the existence of something known only as the shimmer. So after a meteor crashes on a coastline of the fictionalized Blackwater National Park in the film's opening scene, the audience is then shown an enclosed but ever-expanding dome-like space with the physical form of an opaque membrane that is slowly growing and absorbing the hastily evacuated swampland of the Florida Panhandle. Over the film's near 2-hour runtime, the shimmer is depicted as an extraterrestrial event that appears to hide a perplexing and malevolent force. So Annihilation follows our protagonist, Lena, played by Natalie Portman, who is a biology professor and US Army veteran who volunteers to join an expedition for the mysterious Southern Reach organization to explore the zone enclosed by the shimmer. Lena's team consists of 4 other scientists, all women: Cassie, a geomorphologist; Josie, a physicist; Anya, a paramedic; and Dr. Ventris, a psychologist and the team leader. Through events portrayed as flashbacks from Lena's perspective, the viewer learns that several expeditions have already been sent through the shimmer and all have failed to return. While the audience is told explicitly that nothing comes back from the shimmer zone, there has also been one curious exception: Lena's husband, Kane, played by Oscar Isaac, who is the sole survivor of Southern Reach's previous expedition, who now exhibits odd behavior and appears to be dying from undefined complications. Once inside the shimmer zone, also referred to as Area X, Lena's expedition expects to find a ravaged site of unparalleled ecological disaster, but is instead shocked to discover a blossoming, pristine landscape erupting with weird and strange forms of life, as all living things appear to mutate and transmogrify at unprecedented rates. As members of the expedition begin to fall victim to the zone's hidden dangers, Lena eventually traces the field to its source at the base of a lighthouse, before coming face to face with an eerie presence that violently refracts and distorts her inner self. So that concludes the brief rundown of the film's plot. So now we'll get into the second section of the presentation. So while Annihilation is billed as a science fiction psychological horror film at the level of genre and marketing, it also belongs to two important and distinct subcategories that will help to frame our discussion for today. The first of which is first contact narratives, which are traditionally used within science fiction to refer to the initial encounter between differing sentient species. That is, most typically interactions between human and extraterrestrial civilizations. As cultural theorist Frederick Jameson notes, first contact scenarios are a common feature of the science fiction genre due to their ability to question humanity's epistemological relation to an intelligence that is distinctly not I. That is, where not I is not merely nature, but another living being. For Jameson, the grasping inclination and enfolding of the other in the direction of the human is a function of anthropocentrism and a stubbornly rigid feature of categories of human understanding. In this way, first contact scenarios serve as powerful narrative devices for interrogating the intricacies of subjective human experience through the phenomenological rupture of extraterrestrial encounters and the ontological shock that results from a sudden lack of understanding. Beyond any specific alien presence, sentient or otherwise, we can then interpret the subject of Annihilation as a more profound kind of unknowability. The second subcategory is eco-horror, which Elizabeth Parker notes refers to any work of fiction that reflects and expresses our fears of the non-human natural world, as well as our increasingly troubled relationship to this world. In eco-horror, elements of the natural world are featured as agents of retribution, striking back against humanity as a source of mistreatment, neglect, and destruction. Much like first contact narratives, which seek to problematize anthropocentric perspectives and our epistemological relation to the world, these texts frequently blur the boundary between human and non-human, utilizing ecocentric themes and ecological awareness to destabilize notions of control and reason over the natural world. For Parker, the nature of Annihilation is depicted as anything but passive, where the non-human and human become increasingly imbricated under the shimmer's furtive influence. Quote, human-made structures, and all humans for that matter, within its parameters are visibly reclaimed by the natural world. We have here a visual representation of civilizational extinction, as humankind's centuries-long efforts to tame or order the wilderness are strikingly destroyed. While both Vandermeer's novel and Garland's adaptation sit firmly within these categories and leave considerable room for ambiguity in terms of deriving overall meaning, I want to suggest with my presentation today that the film's changes to the original source material invite a particular thematic, metaphorical reading. By gazing at the inside from the outside, Annihilation speaks directly to humanity's fears of the natural world through themes of trauma and transformation, juxtaposing hallucinatory images of human-animal chimeras and killer flora with the alien motivations of a non-human otherness. At its core, then, the film is about pain and how the subjective experience of pain, both solitary and shared, fundamentally shapes our identity. As Dan Olson notes, Annihilation levels several questions at the viewer in order to interrogate our sense of self in the face of the unknowable. Quote, how do we confront and deal with life-changing events, particularly tragedy and trauma? Are we all fated to seek self-destruction by the coding in our very cells, to impulsively pursue our own annihilation? Or is it possible to come back from the brink of self-eradication? So, to understand how Annihilation cultivates this view of the inside from the outside, we need to explore the work of Mark Fisher and the effective dimensions of the contemporary Gothic. Fisher draws connections between our fascination with fiction and the realm of Gothic horror, asking why Gothic, why all these horror stories? Because as Nietzsche warns, to unlearn to pray and curse, unlearn man and God, is to subtract all certainty, to become a stranger to yourself. In Flatline Constructs, Fisher writes, quote, fiction is one of black mirrors through which it becomes us, and the outside gets in. Philosophy has an affinity with literature, but is suspicious of fiction. Fiction is much more demonically protean, a distributed practice of simulation rather than a concentrational form of representation. Through this formulation of a Gothic materialism, we see in Fisher's work the beginnings of his enfolding of the outside and the inside through the liminal spaces of the subject, towards the effective modes of the Gothic as phenomenology. Fiction can include, but not contain, any amount of theory. The outside needs masks in order to get in. In one of his defining works, The Weird and the Eerie, Fisher refers to Freud's conception of the Unheimlich, which is often loosely translated to English as the uncanny, but more accurately translated as the unhomely, describing it as, quote, an uncanny effect that often arises when the boundary between fantasy and reality is blurred, when we are faced with the reality of something that we have until now considered imaginary. For Freud, the Unheimlich is that class of the frightening which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar. So if we think of the Heimlich as private, familiar, intimate, and concealed, then the Unheimlich becomes unprivate, unfamiliar, uncomfortable, revealed. In this way, we can theorize Freud's conception of the uncanny as a sense of strangeness, where unfamiliarity appears to the subject as a rupture at the very heart of the familiar, or more specifically, as a disturbance of the familiar. For Fisher, the popularity of psychoanalysis and Freud's influence has often equated the weird and the eerie with the uncanny. Quote, the examples of the Unheimlich which Freud furnishes, doubles, mechanical entities that appear human, prostheses, call up a certain kind of disquiet. But Freud's ultimate settling of the enigma of the Unheimlich, his claim that it can be reduced to castration anxiety, is as disappointing as any mediocre genre detective's rote solution to a mystery: repetition and doubling. Themselves an uncanny pair which double and repeat each other, seem to be at the heart of every uncanny phenomena which Freud identifies. Fisher's key move in the text is to demarcate these affective modes as phenomenologically distinct from the uncanny, each with differing functions and operative characteristics. The Unheimlich operates by processing the outside through the gaps and the impasses of the inside. By contrast, the weird and the eerie allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside. Fisher explores the weird and the eerie as dominant affective modes within 20th and 21st century fiction. Both modes, he writes, have aesthetic precedents that function through a denaturalization of the world, the openness of the outside, and problematizing the instability of the subject. These features include the otherworldly, ethereal, beyond, inexpressible, radically, and transcendentally exterior. Quote, what the weird and the eerie have in common is a preoccupation with the strange, not the horrific. The allure that the weird and the eerie possess is not captured by the idea that we enjoy what scares us. It has, rather, to do with a fascination for the outside, for that which lies beyond standard perception, cognition, and experience. This fascination usually involves a certain apprehension, perhaps even dread, but it would be wrong to say that the weird and the eerie are necessarily terrifying. So building on Fisher's notion of the weird and the eerie, I've generated a conceptual schema that's useful for thinking through the affective dimensions of the contemporary Gothic. So we have one axis here that represents traditional affective elements, namely horror and terror, as characterized by textual features like spectacle and suspense. Additionally, we can now also factor in Fisher's axis for the weird and the eerie and how these align with ideas of presence and absence. With additional linkages for elements such as shock and the sublime, we can see how a contemporary Gothic text, such as Annihilation, might make use of all four affective dimensions, aligning with and oscillating between them as the story unfolds. So additionally, these tendencies allow us to situate Annihilation among other notable contemporary Gothic texts that might make use of this conceptual schema. I've included some representations of visual media here, such as film and television, as just one kind of example. However, I would contend that this schema could be more broadly applied to all forms of Gothic narrative fiction. So, in Death by Landscape, writer and essayist Elvia Wilk engages with stories that refuse to banish the non-human world by directly engaging with the political potential of the human collective and its historical interconnectedness with conceptions of nature. Referring to Fisher's work on the weird and the eerie, Wilk notes how the weird is manifested in the presence of that which does not belong, through encounters with wrongness and in entities and objects that defy epistemic categorization. As an effective mode generated by subjectivity, the weird represents an epistemological gap, that is, a profound lack of understanding or knowledge. This strange sensation or perturbation is largely felt through the phenomenological rupture of reality. As Fisher puts it, the weird thing is not wrong after all. It is our conceptions that must be inadequate. For Wilk, the key element driving explorations of the weird is one of ontological displacement. By eschewing elements of the unnatural or supernatural, weird stories seek to displace the very concept of nature itself, and by extension, the human. Quote, weirdness resists the idea that everything can be explained by humans, but doesn't give up on the importance of human experience and ability to access and affect the world. This requires some kind of surrender to the unknown, which makes humanity itself an unknown category, whose outlines get messy and whose central importance in the universe is not self-evident. It follows then that weird fiction has become one of the defining ways to articulate the rapidly evolving state of the Anthropocene, where what it means to be a person in the age of drastic ecostemic decline, of planetary extinction, is constantly changing. In these stories, then, the presence and agency of plants and landscape is often inverted. What was once typically used to suggest the passive, the inert, the natural, the plant, animal, and mineral world that constitutes a backdrop for a human actor is granted a strange and vibrant agency that defies our prior states of knowing. To question how the weird might go on to problematize human subjectivity at the level of narrative, Wilk interrogates the idea of selfhood through the use of the two-body problem, asking, where does the self begin and end? For Wilk, the first body is ever-present and phenomenological, one that human beings are intimately and constantly aware of. The body, as Wilk puts it, that you familiarly refer to when you go to work or have sex or feel a headache coming on. The second body, however, is our ecosystemic body, one that is constantly implicated in and influenced by ecologies beyond the individual self. The ecosystemic body differs from the public or social body due to our embodied connection to the world, a world that, at all scales, is profoundly without borders. The ecosystemic body is tethered in ways both identifiable and mysterious to microbes, mosquitoes, whales, ice shelves, landfills, and annual average rainfall, as well, of course, human political and social formations. While our knowledge and awareness of the ecosystemic body may lead to certain actions and outcomes with direct ecological effects, such as conservation or recycling, we nonetheless exist in an era of climate change disruption at a scale where the totality of that body remains forever out of reach, far beyond the limits of human comprehension. Thus, viewed from an ecosystem's perspective, the human being is not a self-contained element, but completely inseparable from all other organisms, both on micro and macro levels. In this way, Wilk declares that forms of ecosystems fiction would be a fiction of new weirdness, in that they seek to destabilize what is known and what is knowable, and they may also be eerie, and that no single human actor or conspiracy of actors is the cause for the world's effects. So returning to Annihilation, the film focuses explicitly on ideas of pain and identity. Trauma, particularly shared trauma, is essential to understanding the film's thematic underpinnings and its connections to weird and ecosystems fiction. Take, for example, the film's opening scene. The crashing of a meteorite into the desolate swampland of Blackwater National Park can be read as a form of global or macroscopic trauma, an extraterrestrial wound inflicted upon a planetary ecosystem already on the brink of collapse. This traumatic event both opens and drives the film's plot, with smaller scale traumas coming to define each primary character within the narrative. Additionally, each woman in Lena's expedition is revealed to be suffering from a deep personal trauma. Cassie is consumed by grief at the loss of her young child to leukemia. Anya is an addict caught in the grip of self-destruction. Josie is depressed and suicidal, shown to be hiding self-harm scars down her arms. Through this motif, the film also positions Ventress as the antagonist in direct opposition to Lena, with both women sharing in a form of trauma bond that yields differing motivations. After his return from the Shimmer, Kane is dying of mysterious unknown causes. In Lena's interrogation scenes, it is revealed to her that Ventress was dying from terminal cancer. While Lena may lose her husband and resolves to fight the Shimmer, to beat it and win, Ventress, by contrast, has nothing to lose and wishes to face the Shimmer, to stare directly into the face of unknowing. These circumstances force both women to push on relentlessly to the film's dramatic conclusion, refusing to turn around and go back even when all other members of their expedition are dead. As the film progresses, these deaths come to represent extensions of each character's trauma. In one memorable exchange with Lena, Cassie ruminates on her grief and loss in a way that mirrors Wilkes' two-body problem. Quote, "In a way, it's two bereavements, my beautiful girl and the person I once was." This quote appears to foreshadow her own death, when Cassie is the first to fall victim to the Shimmer, after being mauled to death and dragged away by a bear. Just as the person she once was is irrevocably changed by leukemia, an event out of her control and beyond her understanding, her fate in Area X is just as random and sudden. Similarly, Anya's tendency to self-destruction takes hold in the wake of Cassie's death and further shocking discoveries, fueling a cycle of rage and paranoia that inevitably gets her killed by the same inexplicable force she is fearful of and helpless to prevent. If these deaths embody the shock and existential horror that constitute the reality of the Shimmer, Josie's death, by contrast, is one of peace and solitude in the face of the unknown. As Wilk writes, for the protagonists of weird fiction, the notion of becoming plant is often initially framed as becoming less than human, to relinquish agency, to immobilize oneself, to stop moving forward. And yet what these narratives seek to convey is the sense that rooting oneself, both metaphorically and literally, can be viewed as a ferocious claim to life. While Ventress ultimately seeks to face the Shimmer and Lena to fight it, Josie decides to embrace her own oblivion and merge with the vibrant flora that surrounds her. As Olson notes, quote, "In her final moments, Josie discards her long-sleeve shirt for a tank top, wearing her scars honestly, at peace with revealing her secret self to Lena as she first absorbs greenery into herself before being absorbed seamlessly into the greenery. Josie isn't just metaphorically in harmony with the Shimmer, which is to say her damage, she becomes one with the Shimmer." In this sense, Josie's literal death by landscape can be viewed as a rejection of anthropocentric conceptions of nature and a recognition of different kinds of life, a non-human flourishing made possible only through pain and shared trauma. Themes of transformation also dominate in Annihilation. From the film's early moments, the world is irrevocably transformed by the Shimmer's seemingly cataclysmic arrival. Blackwater National Park and the ecosystem enclosed by the Shimmer Zone is radically altered, twisted and mutated into strange new forms of life. Kane returns to Lena a different person, both inside and out. Each member of Lena's team is fundamentally transformed by their trauma, and these changes act as the catalysts for their internal motivations and, in turn, the film's overall plot. And yet, while transformation is clearly present at the level of setting, character, and theme, we may also consider what this motif comes to symbolize at the level of text and narrative. In her writing on Vandermeer's original novel, Wilk links the quest of the book's unnamed protagonist, the novel's version of Lena in the film, as one of mystical transcendence. Quote, Mystics of the Judeo-Christian tradition, who flourished especially during several centuries of the Middle Ages, were similarly invested in a kind of first contact. For them, this was contact with divine presence, leading to transcendence of earthly self. In Area X, maybe the divine is literally alien, or maybe it's simply nature at its most ecstatic, matter at its most vibrant, the non-human at its most alive, so alive it annihilates not only a single human self, but the category of human altogether. Referencing the work of philosopher William James, Wilke goes on to list the 4 defining hallmarks of mystical experience. 1. Ineffability. Its quality must be directly experienced, it cannot be imparted or transferred to others. 2. Noetic quality. The state may be highly effective, but it is primarily a state of knowledge, whereby one achieves insights into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. 3. Transiency. It is fleeting and impermanent. And 4. Passivity. The subject does not have the power to induce it or control its course. If we consider the case of Lena's expedition, all 5 women have encounters with varying degrees of self-annihilation as mystical experiences, including the 4th, which is only possible after death. For Wilke, if these mystical encounters are to require a form of spiritual transmission, then the body of the mystic is the medium that registers the message. In the world of annihilation, the human body is shown to be both a weird, transitional ecosystem and a site of inscription. Therefore, it's here that we find the core of the film's symbolism. With her death occurring suddenly and without warning, Cassie's death immediately stands out as ineffable. After being mauled to death by the bear, her body fuses directly with that of her killer. When the bear returns to stalk the remaining members of Lena's team, it does so by luring them in with an eerie human cry in Cassie's voice, making for one of the film's more chilling moments. As Josie remarks, imagine dying frightened and in pain and having that as the only part of you which survives. The shimmer itself, Olson writes, acts as a physical stand-in for trauma, depression, terminal disease, addiction, alienation, and grief, and how these moments often leave us unmoored from ourselves. In Annihilation, this shared and communal trauma is then literalized by the transmission and absorption of physical markers. In one of the film's most outright uses of symbolism, Anya's body is shown to possess an Ouroboros tattoo, present yet subtle marker in early moments of the film. When Lena's team discovers the old headquarters of Southern Reach inside the Shimmer Zone, they find the body of a dead team member fused and growing into the side of a pool. A video card nearby reveals the team flaying and cutting the man open, revealing his intestines to be alive, writhing and coiled like snakes. This dead man is also shown to have the Ouroboros tattoo, the same as Anya's. It is this noetic truth that she and the dead man are the same, nothing but twisted loops of the same corrupted form, that causes her inner rage and paranoia to spill over into fear, chaos, and self-annihilation in the jaws of the same bear that both killed and became Cassie. After Josie's passive death by landscape, Ventress and Lena push forward to the lighthouse and the shimmer's source. In earlier conversation, prior to the beginning of the expedition, Ventress asks whether Lena, as a biologist, believes that self-destruction is an innate human trait, coded in and programmed into our very cells. With later knowledge of her cancer diagnosis, the reasoning for Ventress's pessimism and resignation becomes clearer to the audience when faced with the reality of a body that is already destroying her from the inside. Borrowing terminology from psychoanalyst R.D. Laing, both Josie and Ventress represent persons who are ontologically secure, where a kind of willing self-corrosion acts as a conduit for divine contact and transcendence. As Wilke writes, quote, "The mystic finds joy in the dissolution of self, its corruption or partition on the way to nothingness. The so-called insane person fights to retain ontological security out of fear. The mystic actively deconstructs the self in the name of love." Accordingly, when Lena catches up to Ventress at the base of the lighthouse, the shimmer, like the cancer, is already inside her, transforming her. In a hushed dialogue exchange, Ventress acknowledges the shimmer's alien presence and attempts to describe her mystical encounter. Ventress says, "It's the last phase, vanished into havoc, unfathomable mind, now beacon, now see." Lena asks, "Dr. Ventress?" Ventress replies, "Lena, we spoke. What was it we said? That I needed to know what was inside the lighthouse. That moment's past. It's inside me now." Lena asks, "What's inside you?" Ventress replies, in a whisper, "It's not like us. It's unlike us." Louder, she says, "I don't know what it wants, or if it wants, but it will grow until it encompasses everything. Our bodies and our minds will be fragmented into their smallest parts until not one part remains. Annihilation." Ventress is then overcome and consumed by a transformational burst of energy from within, erupting into a pure beacon of light, emulating herself and succumbing to an alien otherness. In describing the tendency towards self-annihilation, Wilke uses the term decreation, taken from 20th century mystic Simone Weil, to describe the impulse to willingly undo the creature in us, that is, to undo oneself, and also the self as such. After being transfixed by Ventress's sudden death, Lena is then forced to confront a refracted doppelganger of her own embodied self, a rapidly evolving life form that offers curious hints towards Cain's ultimate fate. And yet, as the film's narrative flashbacks eventually catch up to the present-day Lena being interrogated by Southern Reach upon her own mysterious return, it's clear that she no longer views the shimmer, Area X, and the radical potential of the agency contained within as frightening. Like Cain, she too is now changed by the shimmer. Under the influence of this alien life, this non-human otherness, the borders of the self have dissolved. Plants, animals, humans, the self is now everywhere. Loss of the bounded self, Wilke writes, is only truly horrifying within an anthropocentric framework that prizes human being in its current state over all other forms and ways of being. Self-annihilation might, paradoxically, offer a path toward ecosystemic preservation. To close now, I want to situate Annihilation in the realm of pre-trauma cinema, where media production allows people to act as witnesses to the instability and impending collapse of the Anthropocene world. According to Ian Kaplan, trauma culture exists when people live in fear of imminent disaster and fears of future threat dominate consciousness. In this way, the proliferation of catastrophe, both fictional and otherwise, means that people suffer effects similar to those from trauma, caused by watching or experiencing the trauma of others. Kaplan refers to the work of Teresa Brennan in noting how the transmission of affect takes place between the audience and cinematic emotions as easily as between individuals in life. Quote, "For Brennan, effects are social and predate the individual. The subject is born into a world of affects that then become his or her own. This readiness to receive the affects of the other, as well as of the culture, and be changed by them, a kind of emotional contagion, explains in part the impact on viewers of dystopian fantasies." At its core, then, Annihilation is about the horror of a self without borders. It's about the pain of individual life, the strain of shared trauma, and the inclination of the self to enfold and enclose the radical other. It's a film about the presence of things which do not belong, and how we might choose to accept the reality of a world beyond our totality of knowledge. It's a film about how our connection to the natural world runs deep, for remaining forever permeable and fluid. In these ways, it's a film about the existential condition of becoming change. Annihilation is about how we become impressed into each other and entwined in the ways that we see ourselves, our fates in complete strangers, a cycle of exchange without beginning or end. Life changes us in unpredictable ways. We absorb our environments and the people around us. As the film depicts, this realization can be both dreamlike and nightmarish. And as Lena acknowledges, sometimes destruction can be beautiful. Quote, "It's not destroying, it's making something new." Thank you.